The morning mist clung to the shoreline like a mother's embrace, gentle and protective, carrying with it the salt-sweet perfume of kelp and sea roses that had bloomed along these cliffs since time beyond memory. For 17 generations, more than 4 centuries of sunrises, the coastal Abenaki had awakened to the same unchanging view. Endless blue stretching toward forever, broken only by the thin line where sky met water, as precise as if drawn by the Creator's own finger. Their village of Pemaquid curved along the granite coastline like a crescent moon, 57 bark-covered homes positioned with such natural harmony that they seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Children as young as 5 summers splashed fearlessly in the shallows, their laughter mixing with the eternal song of waves against stone. Women moved with practiced grace through tidal pools, their woven baskets filling with clams, mussels, and the sweetmeat of periwinkles. Men prepared their birch-bark canoes for another day of fishing, checking nets mended by moonlight, inspecting spears whose bone points had been carved by fathers and grandfathers stretching back into legend. To them, the horizon was just geography, a distant boundary that meant nothing more than the edge of sight, no more threatening than the line where forest met meadow. It was backdrop, not actor, stage, not performer, the static frame within which their lives played out in endless, peaceful variation. But the horizon had been watching them, learning their patterns, counting their heartbeats, memorizing the sound of their children's laughter and the rhythm of their morning prayers. For months now, it had felt the pressure building beyond the curve of the earth, had sensed the approach of something that would change everything, though it had no voice to warn them. Dakota, whose name meant friend to everyone in the old tongue, stood knee-deep in the cool Atlantic waters that had sustained his people since the first stories began. At 14 summers, he was poised on the threshold between boy and man, his lean frame already showing the broad shoulders and steady hands that marked the men of his lineage. His copper skin gleamed with saltwater drops as he raised his fishing spear, a weapon carved from mountain ash and tipped with a point of carefully knapped flint that his uncle had shaped during the long nights of the previous winter. The school of silver fish that had been dancing around his legs just moments before had scattered again, the third time in an hour, their movements erratic and fearful in ways he had never witnessed in all his years of fishing these familiar waters. The fish knew. Animals always knew first, his grandmother had taught him. They could sense changes in the world's heartbeat that humans, for all their cleverness, remained blind to. Behind him on the beach, Ayana sat in her favorite spot, a natural throne of driftwood that the tides had carved into the perfect shape for an old woman's tired bones. Her fingers, gnarled but still nimble after 73 winters, worked sweetgrass into the intricate patterns that told stories without words. Each twist of the green stems carried meaning. The spiral spoke of the season's endless turning. The diamond pattern honored the 4 directions. The braided edge reminded all who saw it that individual strands, however fragile, became strong when woven together. But today her fingers trembled in ways that had nothing to do with age. Ayana had been having the dreams for 7 moons now, dreams that came with such vivid clarity that she woke believing they were memories, expecting to find her lodge filled with strangers' voices and the acrid smell of unfamiliar smoke. In these visions, she saw men with hair covering their faces like winter fur, their skin the color of birch bark stripped too early from the tree. They spoke in harsh sounds that hurt to hear, words that cut the air like stone axes. They brought gifts wrapped in promises, glass beads that sparkled like captured sunlight, metal blades that sang when drawn across stone, vessels that held firewater capable of stealing a man's spirit with a single taste. And behind all these impossible visitors, constant as the North Star, stood the horizon. No longer passive, no longer neutral. Changed, watching, waiting. "The fish are restless today, grandmother," Dakota called to her, his voice carrying a note of frustration that made Ayana look up from her weaving. As she studied her grandson's face, So young, so beautifully unaware of how few mornings like this remained, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever the dream knowledge pressed against the borders of her waking mind. Something flickered in her dark eyes. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The kind of knowing that comes from a lifetime of reading nature's subtle warnings, of understanding that the world speaks in languages older than human words. She had felt this restlessness before, in dreams that left her waking with salt tears on her cheeks and strange words on her lips in languages she didn't recognize. Languages that might have been spoken by men who lived beyond the edge of the known world. The horizon shimmered, just for a moment, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone, except the morning air was cool and sweet with the scent of beach roses, and the sun had barely climbed above the tree line that marked the eastern border of their world. "Come closer to shore, grandson," Ayana said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made Dakota wade back immediately. He had learned long ago to trust his grandmother's instincts without question, even when, especially when, he couldn't understand their source. As his feet found the familiar comfort of water-worn pebbles, Dakota felt something shift in the air around him. A tension, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every hair on your arms stands on end despite the clear sky overhead. 300 miles to the east, beyond the curve of the earth where human eyes couldn't reach, wooden hulls cut through swells that had traveled unchanged for thousands of years. 3 ships moved in formation across waters that had known only the passage of whales and the occasional Beothic canoe for countless generations. Their sails strained against wind that carried no knowledge of the lands ahead. The largest vessel, its hull stained dark with tar and salt spray, bore the proud name Santa Maria carved into weathered planks that had once been mighty oaks in forests now half a continent away. Beneath her patched sails, 93 men labored in spaces so cramped that tall men could never fully stand, breathing air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Captain Cristobal Colon stood at the stern rail, his weathered hands gripping wood smoothed by countless storms, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead with an intensity that bordered on madness. For 37 days he had stared at that same line where sky met water, seeing in it not the simple meeting of elements but the gateway to his destiny. Gold waited beyond that line. Spices, silk. The Indies, with all their legendary wealth, lay just out of sight. What he could not see was how the horizon itself had begun to change, how it had become something more than geography. It had become aware. It had begun to watch. The crew of the Nina and the Pinta, following in the Santa Maria's wake, went about their duties with the mechanical precision of men who had long since stopped believing in their mission, but lacked any choice save to continue. They checked ropes that had been checked 100 times, mended sails that bore more patches than original cloth, and stared with hollow eyes at the endless expanse of water that surrounded them like a blue prison with no walls and no doors. Luis de Torres, the converso interpreter who spoke Arabic and Hebrew and half a dozen other languages, spent his hours at the bow trying to imagine what words he might need in whatever lands waited ahead. How do you say peace to people who have never seen strangers? How do you explain trade to those who have never known scarcity? How do you speak of kings and queens and the Christian God to people who measure wealth in salmon runs and count seasons by the migration of geese? But the horizon knew the answers to all these questions, had known them for weeks now, as it felt the approaching weight of 2 worlds about to collide. It had been watching the ships since they left the Canary Islands, tracking their westward progress with the patience of something that exists outside of time. And with each passing day, as the vessels drew closer to the shores it had guarded for millennia, the horizon had begun to change. Back in Pemaquid, the morning proceeded with the timeless rhythm that had governed life along this coast for so many generations that memory itself had forgotten when it began. The village stirred to wakefulness like a living thing, each family emerging from bark-covered lodges to greet the new day with prayers as old as the sunrise. Elder Samoset, whose weathered face bore the accumulated wisdom of 68 winters, walked the familiar paths between homes with the steady gait of a man whose feet had worn these same roots for 7 decades. His morning rounds were as much ceremony as necessity, a daily renewal of the bonds that held the community together. He stopped first at the lodge of Molly Neptune, the young mother whose first child had been born with the strawberry moon, and who still worried constantly about every cough, every fever, every silence that lasted longer than a heartbeat. "The baby sleeps well?" Samoset asked in the gentle voice he reserved for new mothers, remembering his own terror when his eldest daughter was born 43 winters past. "Like a bear cub after salmon season," Molly replied, though her tired eyes betrayed the sleepless nights she had been enduring. The child was healthy and strong, but something in the air lately had made all the mothers restless, protective in ways they couldn't name. Next, Samoset visited the adjacent lodge where 2 families shared space after a storm had damaged one of their homes the previous autumn. Here, he found the familiar sight of Pequan and Muki engaged in their daily argument about fishing territories, the same good-natured dispute that had entertained the village for 3 seasons now. "The cod run thick by the northern point," Pequan insisted, gesturing toward the rocky outcrop that jutted into the sea like a stone finger. "My grandfather's grandfather fished there when the ice spirits still walked the earth." "Your grandfather's grandfather was a fool who couldn't tell a cod from a flounder," Muki replied with mock indignation. "The southern bay is where the real fish gather. Sweet water flows from the brook there, and fish love sweet water more than children love honey cakes." Samoset listened to their familiar banter with the fond patience of a man who had refereed the same argument in 40 different variations, knowing that beneath their playful rivalry lay a friendship deep as the roots of the ancient pines that crowned the cliffs above their village. These men would fish together, would share their catch equally regardless of where the best runs were found, would risk their lives for each other without hesitation if danger ever came to their shores. But as he continued his rounds, Samoset felt something he had never experienced in all his years of walking these paths, a weight in the air, a tension that made his aging bones ache in ways that had nothing to do with changing weather. The children seemed subdued this morning, their games lacking the wild energy that usually mark the beginning of each day. The women moved about their tasks with distracted efficiency, pausing often to stare eastward toward the horizon that dominated their view like a ruler's line drawn across the world. Even the dogs sensed it. Normally they would be racing along the beach, chasing shorebirds and barking at crabs, but today they stayed close to the lodges, whimpering softly and pressing against their human companions as if seeking comfort from fears they couldn't name. At the southern edge of the village, where the lodges gave way to the sacred grove where their ancestors' remains rested in peace among the roots of ancient oaks, Samoset found Ayana's youngest daughter, Nokomis, grinding corn outside her family's home. Her mortar and pestle moved in the ancient rhythm her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother had taught her, but her eyes kept drifting to the horizon with an intensity that made Samoset's chest tighten with unnameable concern. The corn she ground would be shaped into cakes sweetened with maple syrup tapped from trees that had been old when her great-great-grandmother was young. It would feed her husband Wisakejak when he returned from checking his nets, would nourish her twin sons, Toma and Keme, as they prepared for another day of learning the skills that would make them men, would sustain her infant daughter Pequan, as she grew strong enough to walk the paths her mothers had walked for time beyond counting. Simple food for simple needs in a world where simplicity was the highest form of wisdom. But as Nokomis worked, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of long practice, her mind wandered to dreams that had been plaguing her sleep for the past several moons. Dreams of white wings that were not wings, of voices that spoke in sounds like breaking stone, of gifts that burned the hand that received them. "Do you see how clear the line is today?" she called to her mother. who sat nearby working sweetgrass into patterns that would protect the family through the coming winter. "How straight?" Ayana followed her daughter's gaze to where sky met sea. The horizon did look unusually distinct this morning, as if someone had drawn it with charcoal against parchment. In all her 73 winters, she had never seen it so present, so demanding of attention, so aware. "Perhaps a storm comes," Ayana said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. The sky was clear as polished shell, painted in shades of blue so perfect they seemed like gifts from the Creator's own palette. The wind was gentle, carrying the sweet scents of wild roses and salt spray. Whatever was coming wouldn't announce itself with clouds and thunder. The horizon line stretched endlessly in both directions, a perfect mathematical curve that followed the Earth's gentle arc with precision that spoke of forces too vast for human comprehension. For millennia, it had been passive, a backdrop against which life played out its endless dramas. Fish swam beneath it, birds flew above it, storms crossed over it, seasons changed around it, but it remained constant, neutral, just the place where sight ended and imagination began. Until today. Today, for the first time in its existence, the horizon had something to hide. Dakota abandoned his fishing and walked back to shore, his bare feet finding familiar purchase on stones worn smooth by countless tides, each pebble shaped by forces older than memory. As water dripped from his copper skin, he felt the first true chill of the morning, not from the ocean breeze but from something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from the horizon itself. His grandmother's unease had infected him like smoke from a green fire, though he couldn't say why. At 14 summers he was already taller than most of the men in the village, his lean frame showing the promise of the powerful build that ran in his family line. He was skilled with both spear and bow, could track a deer through forest thick as night, could read weather patterns in the flight of gulls and the color of sunset clouds. In another year, he would undergo the vision quest that would mark his passage to manhood, 4 days alone in the sacred mountains with nothing but water and the spirits of his ancestors for company. He had never known fear of anything the ocean might bring. Storms were to be respected, but not feared. They brought cleansing and renewal. Great whales were dangerous only to the foolish who forgot to show proper respect. Even the rare presence of metulin, the underwater spirits that could capsize a canoe with a gesture, held no terror for those who followed the proper protocols and made the appropriate offerings. But as he looked toward the horizon now, something cold and foreign moved through his chest. Not the clean fear of a bear encounter, when adrenaline sharpened every sense and made your body sing with readiness. Not the exhilarating terror of navigating rough seas in a birch-bark canoe, when skill and luck and the favor of the water spirits determined whether you lived or died. This was different, deeper, the kind of fear that lived in stories told around winter fires about spirits that walked between worlds and changes that could unmake everything familiar, the kind of fear that had no name because it had never been needed before. "Grandmother," he said quietly, settling beside Ayana on the sun-warmed sand that had been shaped by the feet of his people for more generations than anyone could count. "Tell me about the dreams." Ayana's hands stilled completely on her sweetgrass weaving, the half-finished pattern freezing in a moment of incompletion that felt suddenly ominous. In all his years, Dakota had never asked about her dreams. Children didn't need to carry the weight of an elder's visions. Dreams were for the old, who had learned to bear the burden of seeing too far ahead, too deeply into the spaces between what was and what might be. But something in his voice, a quality she had never heard before, an echo of the dreams themselves, told her that childhood was ending for her grandson, whether any of them were ready or not. "They come every moon now," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves against stone. "Ships with white wings, like gulls but wrong, wrong in ways that make my spirit sick to remember. Men with hair on their faces like winter animals, their skin the color of birch bark stripped too early from the tree. They bring gifts wrapped in promises, glass beads that catch light like trapped spirits, metal blades that sing when drawn across stone, vessels that hold firewater capable of stealing a man's spirit with a single taste. She paused, her weathered fingers tracing patterns in the sand that matched the designs she had been weaving into sweetgrass. Spirals and diamonds and lines that seemed to map some geography of warning that existed beyond the reach of words. And they all come from there. She nodded toward the horizon, and as she did, both grandmother and grandson saw it shimmer again, more pronounced this time, like heat waves rising from stone in the height of summer. From the place where the world ends, the place where nothing should be able to live, where the great water serpent sleeps in coils too vast for understanding. The horizon shimmered a third time, and this time they both saw it clearly, a distortion in the perfect line that divided earth from sky, as if something massive and invisible was pressing against the barrier between what was possible and what was not. Miles beneath their feet, in the sacred caves where their ancestors had left paintings of spirits and prophecies on walls of living rock, ancient pigments seemed to pulse with new life. Images that had remained unchanged for 30 generations. Stick figures dancing around fires, animals blessing hunts, the sun and moon in eternal balance, now showed something new, or perhaps something that had always been there, waiting for the right eyes to see it, waiting for the moment when the old agreements between earth and sky would be tested. White wings on the endless water, strange faces beneath metal caps that caught sunlight like mirrors, and everywhere, dominating every vision, the straight line that divided before from after, known from unknown, the world that was from the world that would be. The horizon had become a doorway, and something was preparing to step through, without conscious decision, without discussion or ceremony or any of the formal protocols that normally governed their movements. The people of Pemaquid found themselves walking toward the shoreline. It began with one, young Pequan, barely old enough to walk steadily on her own small legs, toddling toward the water with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Her movement caught her mother's attention, and Nokomi's followed, still carrying the wooden bowl filled with ground corn. Her husband, Wisakejak, emerged from their lodge where he had been repairing a fishing net, his hands still tangled in the careful knots that connected one line to another in patterns that had been perfected over countless generations. The movement spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Elder Samoset came, his morning rounds forgotten. Molly Neptune appeared with her baby pressed against her chest, the infant's dark eyes wide and solemn as if she too could sense the weight of the watching. Pequan and Muki walked together, their perpetual argument about fishing territories temporarily set aside in the face of something that made such concerns seem suddenly trivial. They arranged themselves along the beach in a loose crescent, facing east toward the place where every day began and, according to the oldest stories, where every ending would come from as well. Not fleeing, not gathering for war council or seasonal ceremony, just drawn. Called by something that spoke in frequencies older than language, summoned by a presence that had no name in any tongue they knew. 57 souls standing on sand that had been shaped by the footsteps of their ancestors since the world was young, all of them turning their faces toward the horizon that had watched them grow from children to adults to elders, that had witnessed their births and deaths and every ordinary day between, that had been as constant as the North Star and as reliable as the turning of seasons, all of them feeling for the first time in their lives like they were being watched back. "Do you feel it?" whispered Nokomis, her voice carrying clearly an air that had grown still as held breath. She took her son Toma's small hand in hers, and he immediately grasped his twin brother Kime's fingers, the chain of contact spreading through the gathered crowd like links in a net designed to hold them all together against whatever was coming. Dakota nodded, and the gesture was copied by every person on the beach. They all felt it. The weight of watching eyes that had no physical presence they could identify, no source they could point to or name. The sensation of being studied, measured, evaluated by an intelligence vast and patient and utterly alien to everything they understood about the world. The feeling of standing before a mirror that reflected not just their bodies, but their souls, their histories, their dreams and fears, and the accumulated weight of all their generations. The horizon was no longer just a line in the distance. It had become a presence, a consciousness, a living thing that watched them with all the intensity of a hunter who had finally spotted prey after a hunt that had lasted longer than recorded time. But what none of them could understand, what they lacked the concepts to grasp, was that the horizon wasn't their enemy. It wasn't preparing to destroy them or hunt them or consume them. It was their witness, their mourner, the only thing left that would remember how they looked in this moment, proud and whole and innocent of what was coming, the only consciousness that would carry the memory of their laughter and their songs and their gentle way of being in the world into whatever came after. The ships were still hours away, invisible beyond the curve of the earth. The men aboard them continued their daily routines, checking ropes, mending sails, staring with hollow eyes at water that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Captain Colon maintained his vigil at the stern rail, his weathered hands gripping wood smoothed by countless storms, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead with an intensity that bordered on divine obsession. None of them knew that they were already expected. None of them suspected that their arrival had been anticipated for months, prepared for in ways they couldn't imagine, witnessed by forces they had no words to describe. But their shadows had already fallen across the shore, and the horizon could feel the weight of all the tomorrows pressing against today like water against a dam that was about to burst. Could sense the exact moment when the old world would end and the new one would begin, when the line between before and after would be drawn in water and blood, and the tears of people who had never imagined that their peaceful morning could be anyone's last. For 17 generations, 427 years of sunrises, the coastal Abenaki had watched the horizon with the casual attention of people who had never needed to fear what might come from beyond the edge of sight. Now, in these final hours of the world they had always known, the horizon was watching them back, memorizing their faces, learning their names, preparing to serve as the only witness to the end of an age that had lasted since the ice spirits retreated to the far north and the world became warm enough for corn to grow and children to laugh. The children played on, building castles in sand that would be washed away by evening tide. The mothers sang ancient lullabies that had soothed babies to sleep for more generations than anyone could count. The fathers planned tomorrow's fishing, discussing tides and weather and the migration patterns of the great cod schools with the easy confidence of men who believed tomorrow would be exactly like today, only better. But the watching had begun, and once the horizon starts watching back, everything changes forever. The morning was still young, the sun barely halfway to its noon position. The day still perfect, painted in shades of blue and green and gold that made the world seem like something crafted by benevolent spirits for the pleasure of mortal eyes. But somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, white sails strained against winds that carried the scent of two worlds about to become one. And the horizon held its breath, counting heartbeats, memorizing faces, preparing to remember everything about this last perfect morning when the world was still whole and the future was still unwritten, and the people of Pemaquid still believed that they were the only human beings who had ever existed. The watching had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again.